As some of you may know, I recently spent several weeks in Spain, visiting several historical sites, some of them medieval, but especially many ancient ones. I even had the chance to do a few small lectures on site. It was a lot of fun. While I was there, I had the chance to look at and think about the artifacts left behind by peoples long gone, to think about the people themselves, what their lives would have looked like, especially when standing amongst ancient ruins. As I did so, I was reminded of an Anglo-Saxon poem, one which reminded me that I was not alone in this contemplation. This Old English poem, probably from the 8th or 9th century, today known as The Ruin, gives us a look into the mind of someone who similarly considered the lives and fates of those who came before. So, as I thought about these ruins, I figured I would take the chance to share it with all of you. Wondrous are these ancient wall stones, shattered by time, foundations shaken by fate. The old work of giants, crumbled, corrupted. Rooftops in ruin, towers tumbled down. Gate locks lie broken, frost chokes the lime, ceilings sapped with age, the high hall loftless. The mortar is mouldy, the master builders are gone, buildings and brave men in the clutch of the grave. 100 generations have passed away, princes and peoples now forgotten. The ruddy wall stones are stained with gray, rocks that have outlived the reign of kings, the crash of storms, the crush of time. Still something remains as a fierce reminder. Walls scored with weapons, grimly ground down, the old work of smiths, skillfully wrought, shining and bright, now dull with dust. The mind of the builder crafted a clever idea, to bind the walls in circular shapes, with strips of wire, with rods and rings. The burg halls were bright, the bathhouses beautiful, the gabled roofs grand. The sounds of warriors, their steps and shouts reverberated under roofs. The mead halls were full of wine and revelry, until fierce fate overturned everything. Proud men were slaughtered, a plague attacked, grim death gathered up a whole host of people. Their ramparts were ruined, their halls laid waste. Their cities crumbled. Warriors were wounded, craftsmen killed, no builder was left alive. The halls grieved and fell, arches angled down, tiles tumbled, red stone hit the ground. Broken piles where once men sang and played the lyre, clothed in splendor, adorned with gold, gladdened with wine, gazing on treasures, shining armor, silver and gemstones, precious jewels, a bright city, a burgeoning kingdom. There were stone buildings and hot springs, bringing bath water in the wall's embrace. That was convenient, as the hot streams poured over the gray stones into a circular pool, a pond in a building, a kingly thing. Most scholars agree that the poet was inspired by the Roman ruins of the city of Bath, though he may not have been describing Bath itself. It may have been an imaginary city. In any case, the ruins are clearly Roman. There have been all sorts of discussions about the meaning of the poem. Many have taken it to be a discussion of transience, observing how nothing is permanent, no matter how glorious. In this way, the poem may have been thematically inspired by Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which was translated into Old English under King Alfred the Great. One of my favorite books, by the way. Lawrence Beaston sees it not so much as commenting on the transience of the city, so much as its people. After all, the city remains, and the poet can still see that it was an incredible thing. In fact, it's still incredible, even in its ruined state. The people are what are gone. Kingdom after kingdom has passed, their lives extinguished dramatically, but the city crumbled more slowly, and still stands as a reminder of their glory. The commemoration of heroism and glory was important in Anglo-Saxon society. Beaston draws parallels between the ruin and Beowulf's wish to have a barrow built for him after his death, in order that his deeds be remembered. He sees this poem as a celebration of the city's past glory, pointing out again a parallel with Beowulf, as the description of the city is reminiscent of the description of Hrothgar's great hall, Heret. Beaston even notes that there might be a twinge of nostalgia for the earlier age of heroes and warbands, where warriors gained glory on the battlefield. Now, warfare remained an essential part of Anglo-Saxon society, and even later English society for a long time, certainly throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. But the 8th and 9th centuries saw a shift from focus on the warband towards a more court-centric society, where political appointments and offices became more important. You see a similar longing for the glory days of heroes in another poem in the Exeter manuscript called The Seafarer. Both of these poems are part of a collection of related poems in the manuscript, often lumped together as the elegies. As I often say, there's nothing more constant in history than people complaining that things aren't the way they used to be back in the good old days. Beaston also sees the poet as reflecting on his own society as being in a state of decline, but I find this to be a bit of a stretch. Despite the possible nostalgia for the recent past of his own people, there's nothing to indicate that his marveling at the glories of this past civilization implies that he sees his own as backward. It's possible to admire something without feeling inadequate in comparison, and I don't personally see any evidence for that leap. Others have taken a different interpretive lens, however. James Doubleday looked at the philosophy of history present in texts popular in England at the time, Augustine's City of God, Orosius's History Against the Pagans, and Gildas's On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, all of which note a close connection between the falls of civilizations and the sins and moral shortcomings of their people. Although he acknowledges that just because these ideas were available doesn't mean that they were necessarily used by the author, he sees the possibility that the poet was using the description of the city's wealth and splendor to explain why it fell. He notes, for example, that the warriors are called proud, and that wealth, the love of wine, and even public baths had been criticized in the works of moralists, which would have been available to the poet. That said, the religious and moralist interpretation has its critics. If this is the message the poet was trying to get across, it was incredibly subtle. Some of the other elegies in the Exeter manuscript do have moral messages, but they're much more explicit, and those ones are more focused on interpersonal relations. The fact that Gildas also mentions plague followed by war may be connected, but the poet may have just taken this as a historical fact, even if he had no intention of looking down at the city's builders. Or plague and war may have just been the standard assumptions for how cities are abandoned. The poet didn't exactly have our modern ideas about history and trends of changing settlement patterns and such, so why else would such a glorious thing be allowed to fall into ruin? Regardless of the poet's intentions, however, which we'll likely never fully know, it's certainly possible that his audience could have read it either way. For some, it was a celebration of heroic glory, which sadly passed away but is still remembered. Or that glory can be remembered even after one's own death. For others, it may have been a reminder that pride comes before the fall. Others still may have seen it as a reminder that those things we hold dear are temporal, and that fortuna, in Boethius's words, or wyrd, fate, in the poets, can change them at any time. Of course, any combination of these or other readings is also possible. But what we do know is that the poet was intrigued by the past. This isn't all too surprising for an Anglo-Saxon. They lived in a land full of reminders that their world was long inhabited. Old English even has a word for the contemplation of the past, dustskjæving, literally dust contemplation, which the scholars Mitchell and Robinson see as a reflection of the commonality of this practice. The reverence for all things old also comes about in literature, with the age of a sword, for example, being closely tied to its quality, especially as it's passed down from one generation to the next. There's even archaeological evidence for the importance of old structures, with many Anglo-Saxon burials up to the 8th century being focused around old monuments. Be they Neolithic, Bronze Age, or even Roman structures, nearby Anglo-Saxon grave sites are often centered around these monuments of ancient peoples. Even Beowulf's burial mound was built near the lair of the dragon he slew, which is described to resemble a Neolithic chambered tomb, said in the poem to have been built by an ancient people. Now, I'm not an Old English poet, but I do find myself looking at a lot of material remains left behind by those long gone. And so I do feel a sort of kinship with this poet, whose actually further removed from me than those ruins were from them. Our interpretations of the ruins may differ, but our intrigue is the same, that sense of awe which the ancient philosophers saw as the source of all contemplation. As for you watching, I assume you feel similarly to some degree. If so, I hope you'll find more old things to look at and appreciate in the near future. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.